Torna Fem Ciència, una sèrie per repensar el feminisme, la història i la cultura científica. Aquesta 5a temporada està dedicada a les ciències quàntiques. En aquest últim episodi de la 5a temporada de Fem Ciència enfocat a les ciències quàntiques, parlarem en una taula rodona amb les membres del grup Women in the History of Quantum Physics. L'entrevista es va gravar a principis de juliol, just quan s'acabava de publicar un llibre amb el mateix nom, que recupera 16 dones en l'àmbit de la física quàntica. Les participants seran la Charnell, la Daniela Monaldi, la Paula Diogo, la Michelle Frank i jo mateixa, la Rivera Colomer. Primer de tot, les historiadores de les ciències presentaran elles mateixes i la física sobre la qual han escrit el capítol en el llibre. Després, aniran 2 blocs centrals de la taula rodona. El primer dedicat al rol de les dones en la física quàntica, passant pel reconeixement, les estratègies de resistència, els obstacles, i el segon centrat en el llibre, com per exemple les motivacions, experiències i previsions de futur. Comencem! I'm Mar, I'm a young historian of science, and for the 5 past years, I've been working in FEM Ciències project, which is a series of online interviews that I'm conducting to women working in history of science. And in one of these interviews, I met Adriana Minor, who also participated in the book. And a couple of weeks later, we met in person in a congress, and she proposed me to do like an interview to Ana Maria Cheto, who is the woman who I wrote the book about. And then with Adriana Minor, we organized that I can fly to Mexico. And then I met Ana Maria Cheto, and I conduct an oral history with her. And then that's why I write the chapter about Ana Maria Cheto in your book.
My name is Charnell Chasten Long. I'm an assistant professor at North Carolina Agricultural and Technical State University, where I serve as a science educator. So I primarily teach teachers how to teach science methods, focusing on elementary and secondary education here in the United States. How I came to write about Carolyn Parker. So I was invited to submit a chapter to this book, and I was looking for women to write about, and I knew I wanted to write about an African-American woman. So I initially just picked Carolyn Parker because she worked at a historically Black college and university, and I work at a historically Black college and university. So I was interested in her experiences working at a HBCU. But in doing the labor of recovering her story, I learned a lot about her experiences and was able to find some new information about her life. So it was very exciting to write about Carolyn Parker.
So I'm Maria Paula Diogo. I'm a full professor on the history of technology and engineering at Nova School of Science and Technology in Lisbon, Portugal. I'm now serving as part of the board of directors of our national funding research agency. So I'm serving in a different capacity now for 3 years. I'm now finishing this period. I've written on Lídia Salgueiro together with my colleague Ana Simões. Actually, myself, Ana Simões, and another colleague, we kind of began the research on history of science and technology in Portugal as a professional area. And we have tried to deal with the science and technology in so-called peripheries, and in the Portuguese case, through different political regimes. So during the late 19th century to the late 20th century. And by doing so, we had this period during the dictatorship in which there was a period in which some of the teachers that opposed the regime were sent away from Portugal. And in the case of the Laboratory of Physics in the University of Lisbon, actually the laboratory continued to be run by a woman who was able to keep researching in the main areas that the laboratory used to do it, because precisely it was a woman, and it was not perceived as a danger to more powerful groups conducted by men, mainly one on nuclear physics coming from Spain, Júlio Palacios, very close to the Spanish dictatorship. And so we found it a very interesting case, both because it was a woman, also how these kind of asymmetries of power, in fact, can lead to a situation that was a kind of unexpected if we would just run through the Portuguese history. And so that's why we chose Lídia Salgueiro to write our article, and also to bring to the forefront the fact that sometimes in different political contexts and in countries such the ones in the south of Europe, we have to look for different things in order to get information and also to get a clear picture of how scientists deal with the specificities of being not in the center of Europe. So that's it.
My name is Michelle Frank. I am a former social justice lawyer turned writer, and I'm focusing on underrepresented voices and stories that have been obscured. And so stories of women in science fall into that category quite comfortably. And I actually came across my subject, Qiansheng Wu, with the help of another member of the Women in the History of Quantum Physics community. I met Elise Krull, who is a faculty member at City College at CUNY, and she pointed me to a lovely book, a fictionalized biography about the history of quantum physics. And it's by Louisa Gilter, called The Age of Entanglement. And not surprisingly, most of the protagonists were men, but about 2/3 of the way into that book, there's a mention of Qiansheng Wu, and I wondered who she was. I was absolutely intrigued, and the more I began to follow this thread, the more fascinating she became through conversations with other women and men as well, but the scholars who are part of Women in the History of Quantum Physics. Yet another participant mentioned that, in fact, Wu had been the very first scientist to document entangled photons in a laboratory. And that scholar is Indianara Silva, who's based in Brazil. And so these pieces began to come together, shining a light on how important this scientist had been. I was startled by how relatively little had been written about her compared to some of her male colleagues, and got very interested in resurrecting her story.
Thank you. I'm the last one. My name is Daniela Monaldi. I teach in the Science, Technology and Society Department at York University in Toronto, Canada. And I am a historian of 20th century physics. I had worked previously on the history of Bose-Einstein statistics, the origins of Bose-Einstein statistics. I had participated in the project about the history and foundations of quantum mechanics at the Max Planck Institute in Berlin, Max Planck Institute for the History of Science in Berlin. And so I was contacted by Michael Janssen when he started as part of the activities of the Forum for the History and Philosophy of Physics of the American Physics Society, when he was starting to think about launching a working group on women in the history of quantum physics. I was contacted by him, and he asked me if I wanted to participate in the working group, and I said yes, of course. At that time, I had just co-designed a course on exploring gender in STEM for my department, and so it just seemed a perfect fit for me to begin investigating in close detail the personal history of a woman physicist in the period of the birth of quantum mechanics. And Laura Chalk just happened to be a good subject for me because she was Canadian. She worked at McGill University, Montreal. And, for me, working in Canada, that seemed to be a rather natural choice.
Aquest primer bloc, dedicat a les dones de la física quàntica, serà el més extens de la taula rodona. I la idea és que vagi de casos particulars de cadascuna de les dones físiques dels vostres capítols cap a idees més relacionades amb una imatge més general de la disciplina. Ja que, si no, moltes vegades es cau en definir el rol de les dones a partir o en comparació amb la dels homes, els quals han ocupat gran part d'aquesta disciplina. Moltes vegades són els anomenats Knabenphysik. Com ja sabem, la física quàntica durant molt de temps s'ha vist com la joia de la corona de la física. Fins i tot el camp ha adquirit una certa mística al llarg del temps i sobretot s'ha entès com un camp completament masculí. Per tant, quin rol van tenir les vostres protagonistes en el camp de la física quàntica?
I can say, what I think is the general answer to the question. Even though we should be very careful to generalize, I must say that what I've learned is that, the workings of gender and the experiences of women, as well as other researchers in the history of physics, is very varied. It's complex and it depends on very local specific circumstances, and it's hard to say anything general that is valid for everyone. But it seems to me one thing that I've learned is that women covered the whole gamut of roles that were necessary for the development of this cutting-edge field of research in the 20th century. We find them being theorists, experimentalists, instrument makers, laboratory, really runners, the real figures who run entire laboratories. We find them being teachers, a very important role, and a valued kind of role, office assistants, and more. There isn't even though there have been specific cases in which it seems to, there have been particular circumstances in which there's been a concentration of women carrying out one particular kind of work. In fact, the more we look, the more we find women in every kind of role in the mass of labor that's necessary to develop such an important field as quantum physics.
Yeah, in my case, what we found interesting is that, in fact, concerning quantum physics in Portugal, the fact that the laboratory, after two scientists were expelled from the University of Lisbon, the fact that a woman was able to continue a research mostly in the same area, which was the X-ray spectroscopy and the gamma ray spectroscopy in vacuum, that allowed the group to continue to develop their research. In fact, the other part of the group, in a way, went for something completely different within the quantum physics, mostly linked to medical applications. And the fact that this small group of women were able to continue in the University of Lisbon and were able to pursue this kind of research, for instance, using a little bit backwards instruments, but continuing to do a kind of a bricolage, in the sense that they used it because they could not afford more money, which went to the male group actually, but they kept doing this kind of research. They kept being connected with their fellow colleagues who were in France, mostly connected with Marie Curie laboratory. This allowed it for the research in this field not to disappear in the faculty of sciences in the University of Lisbon. So that's not something in the kind of very avant-garde kind of work, but still it was relevant in order to avoid the completely disappearance of research in this area. So that's why I was precisely mentioning that in the first time I mentioned before was the fact that as in men, in women, you cannot, and as our colleague just mentioned as well, you cannot try to find something that fits all contexts. In fact, the relevance may be something that is relevant in Portugal, may be completely irrelevant in the United States or in France. But we should precisely try to fit our framework and our lens in order to try to figure out what kind of picture in fact exists there. And in that case, you get information which is relevant in this case. So that's why we went for Lídia Salgueiro. And also just one more thing, and also because Lídia Salgueiro, concerning the Portuguese context, she married a student, a PhD student, who was younger than she, which was not common at all. And particularly because during the dictatorship in Portugal, women concerning the market jobs, the job market, they had to be allowed by their husbands to have a job. So it was a completely unusual context in which she was able to keep her own research. Her husband was also in the same field of research. She continued to do research in a very low profile way. He turned out to be in most of the directing jobs in the university, but she was able to keep the research. She was able to keep her group mostly of women, and also she had 2 kids. So this kind of mix, entangled histories, personal histories, and also scientific histories was what we were trying to bring to our readers.
I would say for Carolyn Beatrice Parker, the timing in which she attends college is very important. So in the United States, you're seeing a shift in higher education between the 1920s and 1930s. And because of the impact of World War I, you see an increase in women going to college, because as colleges, of course, enrollment is important to keep your college open. So you see more women attending college. And you also see the curriculum is changing during this time. So women are starting to gain access to curriculum that they may have not had access to previously because of ideas about who can study those subjects. So for Carolyn Beatrice Parker going to college in the 1930s, this is the right time for her to go into physics. And so I think when I think about her contributions to quantum physics, I sort of think of her work as primarily experimental, contributing to infrared spectroscopy and pi mesons, primarily in graduate school at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. But I also think of how she had a deep understanding of computational physics, which she was able to apply to aircraft technology during World War II. So I think the timing was right for Carolyn Beatrice Parker to go into quantum physics. And I think it's important to understand how the landscape of education impacts women's access to physics.
I think it's a great question that you ask, and I want to bracket our conversation with it's sort of in partnership with what Daniela began with, which is to say that there is no one size fits all. Speaking in the capacity as one of the co-editors of this volume, I learned so much about the ways in which women show up across time, across fields, across roles, and what we really reinforced through all of our work and through the volume itself is that women were there all along. And yet there's a sort of dual reality to the process of telling women's stories. There's not one particular pathway, neither toward participation nor one particular pathway of exclusion, but these things manifest in multiple shapes and sizes. And so we see so many different ways that women participated, and equally as many ways that women were pressured to exit or minimize their participation. But when I started by saying this is a dual reality, I meant both that women are there all along, but their stories are not always there. The recognition of their contributions was not always there. And so we have a particularly important role to play in surfacing those stories. And I think one of the really magical elements of this volume is that it surfaces stories across such a wide range of times, locations, identities, and types of involvement, which reveals something not only about the experience of women, but the field itself, how broad it is.
May I just add something to what Michelle just mentioned? I think that one of the things that it's relevant, and it's relevant in this volume as well, as far as I can tell, is the fact that sometimes we kind of just try to transpose the framework of a scientist, a male scientist, to women in a way. And that's something that we should not, that's something that we have to bring to the forefront, that women have different stories, because sometimes they are married, because they have kids, they have sometimes difficulties in going abroad, which do not have the same, which is not the same as men. And the fact that they are different does not mean that they are less efficient than men. In fact, I've worked on the centers and peripheries for a long time now, and this idea that the peripheries were kind of inefficient centers, sometimes when we talk about women, the same idea comes across, as if we should not talk about the fact that a woman has to stop for 2 or 3 years because she has to attend kids, something that should not be there in a kind of a biography of a scientist, that does not fit. And this kind of parti pris, which is sometimes we still find it in our audience, is something that I think that this book tries precisely to deconstruct and show that they have different stories, yeah, but the difference is good. So in a way, I think diversity is something that we should cherish, and it's at the core of the book. So I think it's interesting to bring it.
And related with that recognition, for example, I would also like to point out that for me, like when I was like reading like the different women that we show on the book, most of them like work like more maybe like in the experimental side, or like sometimes they were like even like seen as assistants or something like that. And I can say that there's like a clear like hierarchy of knowledge. Like sometimes like the fundamental work it's more seen as the most important things, and it's when we like create like this kind of idea of genius, and we create like this image and all like this experimental work, but also like all the assistants, technicians that also participate in the construction of knowledge. Sometimes they just get like unrecorded, and they even receive like less recognition. So that is also like a thing that is also related with the recognition. For example, in the chapter that I write about Ana Maria Cheto, it's interesting because it's like Ana Maria Cheto starts working on quantum physics at the 70s, 80s, so it's like more recent than most of the characters that appears on the book. And she always worked with his husband, de la Peña, and they publish like all the articles, like just the 10% of the articles are published like alone. They always say that they are working like as a team, but like nowadays still when someone is speaking about stochastic theory, which is the part of the quantum physics that they work on, most of the times they just say like de la Peña's theory. Or if you look like on the grade that they have in their universities, De la Peña has like the highest category that he can achieve in the academia, since Ana Maria, who is like now 75 years old, and he could be like emeritus professor, it is still like a regular one. So it's like you can even see like the difference, the symmetries on the recognitions of their job, of their work.
A continuació parlarem sobre quins obstacles i quines barreres s'han enfrontat les dones en el camp de la física quàntica i també sobre quines estratègies i resistències han desenvolupat, tenint en compte que era una disciplina emergent i podia oferir noves oportunitats.
Maybe I will start and then we'll listen to the others, because that seemed to work very well in the previous question. I mean, the observations that my friends have made have been very interesting. So I can start by saying that in my view, I think we need to distinguish between the concrete obstacles that women have faced on the ground, so to speak, in their attempts to undertake research careers, and the subtler biases that have affected historical narratives and reward systems, so the systems of recognition that have been mentioned several times. So this links to something that Michelle has said. Regarding the concrete obstacles, we do need more research, but as far as I can tell at this point, women in quantum physics didn't face more concrete obstacles in quantum physics than they did in other areas of scientific research. Let me repeat that we should be very careful to generalize here. There may have been particular sets of circumstances that created more difficulties, or in other cases, less difficulties for a woman to work in quantum physics than she may have found if she had chosen another field of research. As for example, a lab director who was more sexist than the average lab director, or a situation of social isolation within a specific environment, or vice versa. She may have found a mentor who was more progressive and supportive than the average, or a support network, and so on. So what I'm trying to say is that my impression is that in terms of concrete obstacles in the career path of these women, quantum physics was no different from any other male-dominated intellectual field in a male-dominated society like the societies of the 20th century. But in my view, what distinguishes quantum physics from other fields in terms of gender dynamics is the distinctly masculine image that it projects, which is obviously a cultural construct. So all scientific disciplines historically have been dominated by men, so they have been culturally coded as masculine. But beyond this general pattern, quantum physics holds a special place in our cultural imagination. Mario also said that, it's a sort of a crown jewel of 20th century physics. It's sort of, the epitome of a modern hard science, empirically, mathematically rigorous, as well as philosophically deep, sophisticated, and demanding. And therefore, it's seen as requiring a special kind of raw talent or innate brilliance, or sometimes people say genius. And therefore, it is seen as embodying the quintessence of scientific masculinity, which means in the framework of traditional binary gender logic, this image implies the exclusion or even the rejection of anything associated with femininity. So this is what I see as being distinctive of quantum physics that has affected the recognition and the sense of belonging of women in this field more than, not more than, but it's something that's more specific to quantum physics, while other kinds of barriers to undertake education or to undertaking a career, I don't see anything different in quantum physics than in other fields of scientific research. There have been barriers, no questions about that, but there were no specific quantum barriers to the participation of women.
Yeah, I just wanted to, building on what Daniela mentioned, I think that the same happened in Portugal in this scientific area. Women did not have specific problems that were not common with other areas, mostly concerning political questions, the laws in Portugal for women rights, the fact that, as I already mentioned, the job market was not free for women. They had to have their husbands allow them to go to certain professions. But at least in Portugal, one of the questions that is maybe more specific to quantum physics is that the majority of women going to the faculty, they were to be trained as teachers. So they were supposed to go then to high school to be high school teachers. And in fact, in the quantum physics case, that was not possible. So in fact, going to choosing that area as the main research area meant that either they had to change their scientific interests in order to be to accommodate a position as a high school teacher, or they had to find a way to continue as researchers. And that was one of the problems, finding a laboratory in which women were welcome. And that's the main, precisely the main interest in the laboratory of physics of the Faculty of Sciences, because that was already a fact when Manuel Valadares was the director of the laboratory, but it turned even more relevant when Lídia Salgueiro formed her own group, mostly women. The only man was precisely the student that would be later her husband. Most of them were women, and it's interesting because the laboratory was perceived as a kind of female laboratory, in the sense that there was a different way of being in laboratory. There was tea and cookies, and they stopped every while to have a conversation. And also it is interesting and precisely goes back to what we were discussing about experimenting or more theoretical work. It was perceived as being a laboratory where work was more experimental and in consonance with this idea of women being very resilient, patient, doing lots of things and repeating everything, a little bit as it also happens when we go for women, for instance, in airspace research. This idea that they are more it's easier to trust a woman because she will do it the right way, no matter how many hours she has to do it, but she will keep doing that in a very perfect way because it's this feminine attitude towards science. And this is quite a common discourse among precisely the scientific community at the time. So we are talking about the 50s and 60s, actually.
It's fascinating to me to hear Maria Paula say that, you know, there's this gendered understanding of carefulness and perfection. Because to me, what it highlights is that when something is exceptional and gendered female, it's treated differently than when it's exceptional and gendered male. And my claim here is that exceptionality, outstanding skill itself is not gendered. There's something else happening here. And I think it relates particularly well to what Daniela pointed out too, this idea of gendering either brilliance or participation, experiment or theory. I might argue that it's really not the underlying performance that has any particular tie to one gender identity or the other, but the patterns that we reproduce in our own social interactions where we value whatever we name as masculine. I also want to talk for a moment about the question specifically that you asked, Mar, about how quantum physics might differ from other fields. And I think this is an example of how the answers differ depending on the cultural context in which you examine the question itself. What I'm going to talk about here is the way in which Wu's work was received. We know from a great deal of research by historians of physics that in the post-war era, quantum foundations work was stigmatized. Olivier Friere and David Kaiser are two of the leading names who talk about the stigma that attached to quantum foundations work. And that took on a particularly distinct feature in the United States because of the Cold War. And so in the era when Wu performed her very first experiment documenting entangled photons in the lab, quantum foundations work was still stigmatized. It's not surprising then, although we don't know exactly why she chose not to name that work, it's not surprising that it wasn't amplified. And we see decades later that when Wu returned to the same experimental work with a new graduate student, the underlying culture in the United States had changed in the 1970s. Her status at the university had also changed by then. And we see a change in how this work is named. And at that point in time, it's quite clear that it's named as an experiment engaging with EPR. So in that respect, when I look at this piece of Wu's history, the fact that she was doing work that was located within the subfield of quantum physics plays a role in particular for her life because she's situated in the United States, because she's situated as an immigrant, because she's situated as a Chinese American. All of these identity factors interlace and play a role in the way in which her contribution would be received. And that makes it a bit less surprising that the quantum elements of that work were downplayed.
And just to jump in and sort of continue this conversation about like exceptionalism. So when historicizing Carolyn Beatrice Parker's life, I tried to make sure that it was intentional to not just show the obstacles, but show the support systems that she had in her life and how she was using those to navigate this space. Because a lot of times when we write about African American women scientists, tokenism becomes their exceptionalism. So I try to suppress some of the ideas around her being the first known African American woman in scientists, and I intentionally use the term known because maybe there is someone that came before her. And I wanted to do that too, to show that tokenism and her being the only one in this space is not what makes her exceptional. So pushing back on that being what made her exceptional and focusing more on her contributions and the work that she was doing, but also showing that she's navigating this space as a woman, right? But also that she has allies and supporters that are helping push her through the field. So I think it's important that as historians that we also consider how these histories of obstacles that women face can also jade our perspective in historicizing women. And sometimes I think it causes us to have blinders on and only look for women in certain spaces. And that came up with Carolyn Parker because she was a physicist, a research physicist in World War II, not a lab assistant. But I think that because those are the ideas we have about women's labor, sometimes we don't expect women to be found in the archive and other spaces.
Quin impacte creieu que han tingut els relats dominants com Knabenphysik en la manera en com es presenten altres idees, contextos i actors històrics en aquest camp?
So yes, we know as historians, we know pretty well that throughout most of the 20th century, scientists, historians, philosophers, and sociologists of science have assumed science to be a meritocracy, to have a special character as an institution or a particular kind of activity. We can recall Robert Merton, listing universalism as one of the four tenets of the scientific ethos. So there was this very explicit, passionate belief that personal characteristics such as race, religion, political views, etc., did not affect the system of recognition and rewards in science, but only talent and merit mattered. And that has contributed to make commentators on science less sensitive to topics of, for example, gender bias. Certain questions were just not asked. As you say, it's been only recently that we have started to ask that kind of questions. And then we encountered the obstacle of archives and sources, repositories, databases, and so on that don't help us to answer the questions that we want to ask now.
Yeah, I think that as historians, we know that we have to make a kind of analysis of the narratives and the sources in order to critical think about them and use them. One thing is the narrative about a kind of free-floating science and technology. The other is the reality when you work on specific periods and you understand perfectly there's not such a thing as a free-floating science or technology, and that does not exist not only concerning gender, but also concerning, for instance, centers and peripheries, or concerning political issues. And if you are going to work, for instance, in Portugal, during the dictatorship, it's quite clear that one of the main issues is the political questions. And even if you are a very good scientist, and for instance, Manuel Valadares was a top scientist in quantum physics, in fact, that didn't matter, and he was expelled from the university. So it is clear that it's not a question of being better or being the best or being good. It had a lot to do with your political party, the opposition to the regime, and in this sense, also questions concerning gender. It is quite clear that there, as Daniela puts it, there are lots of questions that we are asking now that were not asked before, both concerning gender, also as Michelle mentioned, and also Charnell, questions concerning, for instance, the role of technicians in doing experiences. So there is a lot of narratives of those who were in a way not voiced during long periods. And the questions we are asking now leads us to precisely try to find where those voices are, and also to, of course, continue as historian to have a critical eye on these sources and try to find a balanced narrative of all the agents in doing science, not only in quantum physics, but in this case in quantum physics, but in other disciplines as well. For instance, engineering, I work a lot in engineers, and in this case, it's a very, in Portugal is a completely unbalanced gender profession during most of the time, until very recently, actually. So, and you have to ask different questions, try to find where these voices are, and that's one of the main challenges for us historians, to do this kind of detective job and find our main protagonists.
That point is not to be understated. I mean, there's such a difficulty around gaps in the archive, and the more underrepresented the voice, the more prevalent those gaps seem to be, because the materials weren't collected, or they weren't respected, or sometimes the person themselves opted not to provide a robust record, either because they had been culturally indoctrinated to not see themselves as important, or perhaps as a form of self-protection because of living in a world that is not always welcoming. And so that makes the work of a historian particularly hard when it comes to recovering those narratives that have been long missing. This is something we saw come up again and again with the contributions to the volume. And as editors, we worked really hard to think about how to work around those gaps. Of course, when somebody engages with the text, unless you do a meta-level analysis of the archive, the reader doesn't see that the gaps are based on historical silences. And so it's always a bit of a challenge to figure out how to build that narrative so that the reader can more clearly perceive both what was missing in the original story, but also what remains difficult to uncover given the sources that are available now.
Now, I would like to also say that I think some of those like archival silences that we experience with writing these chapters is also connected to the history of science, even of our field, of what originally was seen as valuable and scientific knowledge that impact the archival collections that we have. And also a lot of in the early history, a lot of scientists are also writing about themselves. So they're also placing value on their own archival records and collections and making sure they're preserved. And if you did not have a seat at the table or power to curate the collection, then perhaps your materials would have not been included in those collections unless someone just decided like they felt that you were important and they collected it and kept it in the archive. So I think we always have to think about the history of these fields and the construction of archival records and what is valuable. And then also thinking like sort of outside the box of like what archival collections exist outside of traditional institutions. A lot of people have their own personal archives, family histories. It could be in someone's attic somewhere. So there's a lot of different ways we can construct archives to recover women's stories. And I think that we have to just dive in and do that work. It can be tedious, but we do have to do it.
It is more labor intensive. And in fact, as Charnell points out, even an outsider's interest can be crucial, but sometimes insufficient. In Wu's case, for example, when one of the historians who's documented part of her story first approached her, she said, "Oh, I'm not that important." And so there's this process of getting past the self-reflection to collect and preserve a narrative.
For example, in my chapter, I also speak about the sources for history of quantum physics, which were like a collection of oral histories that were recorded from like 4 or 5 young historians of science led by Thomas Kant, who record their own voices of the physicists of that time, like the foundations of the quantum physics. And it's also like kind of when I was like searching like how many women were there, it's also frustrating because they record 102 interviews. Well, they interview like 102 persons, and just of them are women, and 2 of these 8 interviews are just unrecorded, and you are not able like to trace anything else, like why it's not recorded. There is no more information, and it's quite frustrating. And of all these like 102, like just 5 of them are unrecorded, and it's like such a casualty that 2 of them were like women. So yeah.
And I don't know if it's the same with you, but at least we had some experience, not only with Lydia Salgueiro, but with other cases in which there are some archives, family archives, but the daughters, the sons, the grandsons, sometimes they are not very, very willing to share those archives unless they are sure that what you are writing about their family members is something that does not go against the image that themselves have built about the role of that person in a scientific area or in the family itself. So again, as historians, we have to be very sensitive concerning this kind of family histories and try, as our colleagues just mentioned, to push and to show and to try to bring their kind of historian soul to our profit and gather the information and make them feel that they are part of that story. We are not trying to build a picture that is not a good one. It's an historic approach, and that's interesting as well, these dynamics with the family archives. I find it very challenging in a way.
El segon bloc es centrarà en el llibre que es va publicar a finals de juny de 2025, Women in the History of Quantum Physics, Beyond Knabenphysik. Primer de tot, m'encantaria saber quan i on va sorgir per primera vegada la idea d'aquest llibre i quina va ser la motivació principal que hi havia al darrere.
Sure. It was a very exciting process from the very beginning. There was a group that Daniela mentioned early in our conversation, Women in the History of Quantum Physics, formed as a subcommittee of the Forum for Philosophy and History of Physics. And then the group really grew, and it took on a life of its own. In the summer of 2022, I believe, I have to check the date for you. There was a conference that was convened in Utrecht. The University of Utrecht hosted a conference called Greta Hermann and Friends. And Greta Hermann is one of the figures who is profiled in our volume. This was an opportunity for a wide set of scholars to come together in the Netherlands, share preliminary research on the women we were learning about, and engage in discussions about the roles that these individuals played and the contributions that they made to the arc of history of quantum physics. And as these conversations continued for the course of several days, little by little, the conversation also began to include some murmurings about an edited volume, because we were realizing that the work was really inspiring and important and innovative. That's where the idea really began to take shape. But we also needed follow-up. The group continued to meet roughly every month or two on Zoom, bringing together scholars from many different time zones, countries, parts of the globe. And eventually we decided that we were really going to do this. We identified 4 individual members who agreed to serve as co-editors. I was one of those 4. And from there, we were off to the races. It was time to put together a book proposal. It was very much a collaborative effort from the very beginning, which in some ways is poetically resonant with the message of the book itself, which is that quantum physics is also a collaborative effort. It's not the result of one specific mind. And our book came together in very, very much the same spirit. The wisdom, the training, the research, the scholarship of a group of people who brought different angles of view, different backgrounds, different expertise, and we were able to pull that all together with a publishing contract from Cambridge University Press, and suddenly it's real. Here it is.
Ara, com a autores, com ha estat la vostra experiència amb el llibre? Quins reptes us heu trobat a l'hora d'escriure, trobar les fonts o el procés d'edició?
Yeah, I must say that I think that we were, in a way, brought to the project because my colleague, Ana Simões, by training, she worked on quantum physics, and I think that she kept those networks running, although she moved from a scientist to a social scientist on the history of science. Actually, her PhD thesis was on quantum chemistry. So she kept having those contacts. I'm an historian by training, but as directors of one of the Portuguese research units in history of science and technology, we edited 4 volumes on the role of science and technology in designing Portugal from the 16th to the 20th century. And of course, in the 19th and 20th century, we came across with questions concerning precisely how science and technology were perceived and were used during the 20th century, first from in the Republican context, and then the dictatorship. So, and we were exploring all these avenues, which were kind of interesting. And when I think Anna received the invitation, we immediately thought about the case of Valadares and go deeper in the case of Valadares being exiled in France, and how did the laboratory kept being running. And we came across with Lídia Salgueiro. We had already some work on her, but in fact not as deep as needed for this book. And so we very gladly engaged in trying to find more and going to archives, also the family archive, but also all the grants that she was able to gather in order to go abroad. So they are also at the one of our national archives. And yeah, it was interesting. So it was a delight to go through this kind of research and go away from more administrative and bureaucratic work that we also have to do. And we did really enjoy having this opportunity to go deep in this specific case, and also to build this dialogue with the editors. Well, it was a very interesting and honestly, we did like this dialogue. We learned a lot, and we tried to move within the general picture of the book, which we did not have immediately. But I think it was a very happy kind of marriage between all the four editors and ourselves, and generally all the colleagues that are in the book. So thank you for inviting us.
Yeah, so I wrote the chapter during my first year as a professor. So I think learning how to juggle responsibilities of a new job and produce a book chapter simultaneously was a struggle for me. But I think the experience allowed me to grow as a historian, because outside of this book chapter, the only other history of science that I've written is my dissertation. So those are different types of writing. So it was definitely a growing experience for me. And I think probably perhaps the biggest challenge was in writing Carolyn Parker, I began with the histories that had already been written about her life, and I was having a hard time getting the narration to work based off of my own understanding of African American scientists and how they navigated the space during World War II and the post-World War II period. So that sort of led me to revisit the archival collections, and I started to see that there were some differences in her experiences and where she may have been. So that sort of shifted the entire chapter, because I would say probably my first version was one way, and then I had to write the editors and be like, I actually see something different in archive and I need to rewrite the entire chapter. So yeah, so so I think it was a great experience. I enjoyed writing the chapter.
Yeah, and for me, I really enjoyed writing the chapter, but it was also like challenging because I was not used to write a lot like in English. So for me, the language was a struggle at the beginning because I was not used to also like the academic, I don't know. For me, like the English was an issue at the beginning, since I also like conduct the oral histories in Spanish with Ana Maria Cheto. So I was not sure like how should I proceed to do like the translation, and because I want to keep it like really close to how she expressed, because she has like a really strong personality, and I think like he choose like really correct words in Spanish, so it was difficult for me, like all this process of translation between the Spanish and the English, and trying not to change the message that she really wants to point out in the oral history. And also like all the process of like editing the book, because since it was like my first chapter in a book, I didn't know that how many steps that you need to pass through and follow until the final edition. But but yeah, it was really nice. And also like I really enjoy, for example, when I need to do like the corrections or like to read like other colleagues, like I actually read about the one from Maria Paula and Charnell, so it was nice like to read your chapters and know
It was
like also
very interesting, yes.
yeah,
That dynamic concerning the other that read a chapter from the book, that was a really nice idea. I think it worked quite well.
Yeah, me too. Because you realize that when you have one idea in mind, and everyone like is writing their chapters in their own way, and it was really nice to see that. So yeah.
This was magnified, tenfold as an editor, because we were engaged with all of the chapters and the wide range of approaches, but also trying to find themes and consistencies that can ensure that the book coheres as a whole without diminishing the individuality and the distinctness of each voice, each subject, each author. It was a tremendous learning experience in terms of methodology, but also content. It couldn't ask for anything more exhilarating.
Un altre tema que m'agradaria parlar és el de l'elecció del gènere biogràfic, ja que, com segurament haureu escoltat, hi ha bastantes veus crítiques, ja que moltes vegades es poden reproduir narracions aplicades als homes, però a les dones, sense qüestionar el paradigma ni la pròpia disciplina. Quins avantatges i limitacions creieu que tenen les biografies en el cas de les dones en la física quàntica?
I can go first if you'd like. I think there are many voices that raise questions about the genre of biography, the field of biography. And I've heard quite a lot of rhetoric about the inherent tension between fields, questions about whether historians view biography as authentic history, where it fits in the disciplinary matrix. But for me, I think that biography is some of the most potent ways that we can share history. As human beings, we're motivated by stories, and we're fascinated by one another. And so if we can bring an individual to life, even in a small piece of their life or a small profile, the history that enfolds them begins to come to life as well. So I see the biographical method as especially powerful and an invitation to a wider range of readers. I also think there's something really magical about how language can be used to redefine our common understandings. And so I think the women who are profiled in this book are brilliant, often geniuses. And my hope is that we can expand our understanding of those words as opposed to removing the words from the discourse, because they really do capture a very wide range. Those words capture a very wide range of contributions.
In my case, actually, when I was a student in history, we were very much shaped by the École des Annales. And in fact, biography comes with it. So in fact, this idea that biography was something that had to be a kind of list of how the person was fantastic and so forth, is not something that falls in the realm of historians, actually. And in fact, I've written with Ana Simões and another colleague, Ana Carneiro, a scientific biography on a naturalist, a Portuguese naturalist from the 18th century, precisely because we think, and in this case the same, that the territory of biography is a wonderful space to cross all the dimensions that make a person, their professional life, their personal life, the conflicts at work, the conflicts at home. So everything that makes us to be historians or scientists as we are not detached from all these dimensions. We don't live in one of these dimensions, we live in all of them. So biography allows us to bring together all these dimensions and to have a full view of the person who is a scientist, but also in this case is a woman, has a personal life, deals with questions concerning being a woman or being in a specific political arena. So all these dimensions come together in biography. So I don't have any problems with writing or reading biographies. If they are good historian pieces, they are good. It doesn't matter if they are biographies or not. And biography, yeah, it allows us to bring together everything we know about the person, and also to make this kind of red line connections, the lines that we don't see at first, but then begin to appear as we move into the person. So I think that's a very challenging way of writing. So, yeah.
També m'agradaria parlar sobre la diversitat representada en el llibre, en termes de territori, cultura, institucions, classes socials, ja que moltes vegades, per molt que s'intenti ser molt plural, és molt difícil trobar dones de les perifèries on moltes vegades no s'ha desenvolupat la disciplina. I per tant, d'alguna manera, seguim reproduint aquest biaix.
It's a really important question. And again, from the editing chair, I would say, in terms of inclusion, this book is an important step in the right direction, but it is not the full journey. We worked very, very hard to try to expand the set of women who would be included in this volume. We recruited and conducted outreach for close to a year, specifically because these were important values. And there's a parallel difficulty that emerges. The more invisibilized a particular subject has been, the harder it is to recover that life, and the more work it requires, and therefore the more difficult it became for potential authors to say yes. There were a number of women who we deeply wanted to include in this volume, and we struggled with whether to name them, because even providing a list of names suggests that there are other names that don't belong on that list. And in fact, the point here is that there are more. We, just a few that we put calls out to potential authors who we would have loved to have included are people like Willie Moore Hobbs, Purnima Sinha, Bibha Chowdhury, Shirley Ann Jackson, and they're just the tip of the iceberg. So we feel we've made some really important progress, but speaking for myself, I would love to see more. And I would love to see this be the beginning step and not by any means the comprehensive completion of this genre.
So volume 2.
I would say, I think all histories have to be revisited, even histories of women in physics that we've already written about. So I think that it's always important to revisit the histories, expand the histories, and I think we do ourselves a disservice when we feel that something can be comprehensive enough to capture the total story. I think we just always have to be willing to do this work.
And as historians, build new conceptual tools, new ideas, sometimes old topics reveal a completely different life if you use a different lens when approaching it. So it's a work in progress always.
I finalment, com creieu que s'ha rebut aquest llibre en els vostres cercles? Quin impacte creieu que tindrà tant a l'acadèmia com més enllà en el públic general?
Yes, I think so. I don't have the book yet, the physical thing, which is always easier to show to your colleagues. But I think that at least we're thinking, myself and Anna, to kind of promote a roundtable with some colleagues and some students in order to talk about the idea of the book, questions concerning precisely, as historians of science and technology, how these kind of new approaches are relevant to the field itself. And also, as both of us, me and Anna, we teach at universities of sciences. In my case, it's science and technology, engineering. In Anna's case, it's mostly scientists. Of course, we are very interested in discussing these kind of issues with our colleagues from the different areas, and particularly from physics as well. And so I hope that after the summer holidays, which are approaching, now we don't have any students really coming to the university, but I hope that in September we can do something in this kind of line, and maybe invite some of the colleagues to be with us as well.
We've been really pleased with the initial reception. And I should say that the initial reception predates the emergence of the book. We have had a couple of very lovely reviews. Our editor at Cambridge was delighted. She said, this doesn't happen for academic books. Typically, they wait up to a year to see reviews. So there's a lot of energy and enthusiasm. As you say, Mar, it's only been a week, so it's early to say how the broader community will respond. But in the 8 or 10 months leading up to the launch of the book, our group has been invited to give talks all around the world. We have been invited to participate in Zoom panels like this one. Since the launch was anticipated, we've been delighted to receive outreach from a couple of podcasts that want to talk about this work. And my hope is that it will continue to generate enthusiasm. I think we have to continue that conversation and see where it goes. I'm especially interested to hear from folks like Charnell, who are teaching in university settings, to find out how the reception is and among the student body, because so many of the contributors are faculty members. I think we have a unique window and a wonderful opportunity to try to spread this information into a wider set of readers than, maybe just your ordinary textbook. But I'll pass it over to Charnell, who may have more to add.
Yeah, so I haven't heard a whole lot yet. I'm waiting on a few people. There's like a few people out there that I really want to know what they think. But I've allowed my students to read some of the chapters and they enjoy it. So they think it's like a breath of fresh air from like what they are typically learning in their physics classes and stuff. So they really like it. They're sort of trying to think about like how they can incorporate the history into some of their lesson plans that they do, because we push hands-on learning, but they sort of like, okay, how can we teach the students about the history of women in physics and not just the how to do the physics activity, or how to do how to get like learn the vocabulary. So that's what they've been talking about, like making like elementary lessons around it. So we'll see. I'm open to it, so I'm like, okay, go for it. So I'll see what they come up with, and then I'll share with the group.
I also think we'll be finding that there are different responses from different audiences, because the book is really written in multiple registers. It's written to appeal to different audiences. There are some chapters that are very accessible and written for a layperson. There are others that have a dense set of formulas and mathematical formalisms to engage with the theoretical work that underpinned that particular subject's contribution, and everything in between. There are some that dive deep into a biographical survey of the subject's life, and others that give only a very small time slice of what was happening. There are chapters like Maria Paula's that are a group biography in many respects, that bring together multiple voices and talk about the interrelationships between a group of contributors. And so that breadth of approach means that there are different parts of this book that will speak to different audiences and that will be more meaningful to one set of readers than another.
I don't know if in your case, Chanel, and also maybe Michelle and Mark, in our faculties, we have small groups on women in STEM, in science, technology, and medicine, group of students in all the courses we have available. and they usually have 2 or 3 workshops per year just to discuss questions concerning women in general, for instance, women in civil engineering or other topics. And I'm sure that in the beginning of the next year, we will be able to have one on this issue as well, on the book itself, by the students, which they invite us, of course, but it's interesting also to hear how they approach the book by themselves.
Yeah, that's really nice. I'm really curious about how I suppose that in the academia it will be easier that the people like get in contact with this book, but I'm really curious like about how it will be like for the students and like a broader public, if it will permeate somehow to a biggest public.
Moltes gràcies a totes les participants per formar part d'aquesta taula rodona. Amb això acabem la 5a temporada de FEM Ciències, Ciències Quàntiques. No us perdeu la temporada vinent. Fins aviat!